and they can actually, the people at home can actually bring up questions through the Facebook page and of Samtökin, right? Yeah, the Facebook page of Samtökin 78, and then we have Daniel here who will bring them up so our guests and panelists can answer them. So I will just open up for questions. Okay. Yeah, okay. Question online. Yeah. This is a question for Piet. What can the Council of Europe do? This is, yeah, I'm sorry, I will have problems with pronouncing the name of it. It's from Finland, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Finland, for the question. Okay, I try to be as straightforward as possible. I consider myself being a politician, a full-time politician, but still an activist. So there will be some elements of both aspects of my personality in the answer. I'm really honest with you. If I consider the Council of Europe a very important European political body, I'll explain to you why. Because of this huge variety of countries being part of the Council of Europe. 47 member states, from Albania to, I think, United Kingdom might be the last one. We take them in an alphabetical order. With a huge variety of attitudes towards issues as LGBT issues and many other issues as well. We don't have, as a Council of Europe, the capacity of making any binding laws or proposals as the European country, as the European Union can do. But the moral impact of what is decided on by the Council of Europe is huge. But, and that's very important, it needs to be, let's say, embraced by local governments and members of parliament. They need to force their governments to implement the reports, the recommendations, and whatever adopted by the Council of Europe. But the impact can be huge, depending on the political will of both parliaments and governments on the national level. But at the same time, I know the impact is limited. As explained, we can't force any government to adopt to the recommendations in a direct way. In my opinion, the impact of the Council of Europe is a little bit bigger than in the countries not belonging to the EU, 28, soon to be 27 members of the EU. The impact of the Council of Europe seems to be a little bit more and a little bit bigger in the other 19 countries. Yes, I think that mainly I really believe in the Council of Europe as an international body where people members of parliament can discuss such sensitive issues and can find, let's say, arguments to convince their own colleagues at the national level, not being member of the Council of Europe themselves. So that's the difference between the EU as well. Members of parliament of the European Parliament are elected directly as a member of European Parliament, and I really like them, that's no problem, but they kind of hide themselves in this, or under this European bubble. And members of the Council of Europe, of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, they don't. They have to return to their own constituencies, to their own parliaments, and they need to find answers and arguments that can convince their colleagues. I think that's one of the powerful instruments of the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Yes.
I think from an activist's point of view as well, I think there are allies within the Council of Europe as well. So I'm just kind of want to mention the Human Rights Commissioner, who has been a really important position for us as LGBTI advocates and other human rights activists, really. So the Human Rights Commission role has been key to kind of really support our fights. And the former, now Human Rights Commissioner at the Council of Europe, has been very vocal and visible about raising visibility about intersex people and intersex children as well. And I hope that the new Human Rights Commissioner will take that lead and continue, being a strong ally within the institution. So, yeah.
Yes?
I do have a question. It's not strictly related to the intersex subject, if I may. It's for your organization, 78. I was quite, I wouldn't say shocked, but surprised anyway that it's so difficult to persuade your members of parliament, government to implement what they have promised many times before. Do you have, as an organization, a list of priorities to focus on and to make it, maybe, I don't know, I'm just looking for a way to explain what's happening, to make it more easy for them to commit to what they already have promised? Is there this kind of list of priorities, and how do you deal with it? Just out of curiosity, it's because I'm not, I don't know much about the specific Icelandic situation.
Well, I mean, in our conversations with the legislature, we do try to sort of keep things simple and stick to, keep to very simple, identifiable objectives, and not to scatter our attention to too many things at the same time. At the same time, as an organization, we are small, volunteer-driven, with very limited institutional memory, which tends to have a lot to do with, serial burnout from volunteers. I'm sure you've seen this in many places. So our ability to sort of maintain focused, continual pressure does fluctuate, and that is one of our weaknesses, to be honest. And so that's definitely an area where I'm sure we have room for improvement within our organization, but also where some basic support, such as consistent, reliable funding at levels anywhere comparable to our sister organization in neighboring countries, would make a huge difference. Because having, we were able in 2016 for the first time to go up to having more than one full-time paid position. And already that has had a huge impact on our capacity. And so just the ability to have people in place who are paid and can stay on message and develop the organization and its capacity from the inside would help a lot.
Since 2015, I've been working on legal issues in Iceland since 2015. And we have basically made 3 focus areas. One of them is trans and intersex rights. That the current trans legislation is outdated. It was already outdated the day it was signed into law. And that this needs to be reviewed to meet the needs of trans people, and that this should be based on self-determination. We've focused on issues that relate to bodily integrity for intersex people. So here we're talking about self-determination, physical integrity, and bodily autonomy. Our third focus area has been anti-discrimination, that it is pitiful that in Iceland today, it is legal for someone to fire someone for being gay. The unions would fight this, but they would have to take a constitutional court to case to see if sexual orientation is covered under other grounds. It's 2018. We shouldn't be discussing strategic litigation in Iceland to sort of force the government to enact anti-discrimination legislation. So those have been sort of our three focus areas when it comes to local residents. Then our sort of fourth focus has been LGBTI asylum seekers, and mostly LG, but occasionally T. There we went from a fairly bad place where just sexual orientation wasn't taken into the picture. We were deporting any LGBTI person we could. But there we've actually managed to make headway. Not in policy, not in legislation, but in practice. So we've managed to be just loud and annoying enough to the people that we need to be loud and annoying enough to, for them to sort of start looking at what they're doing and changing their practice. That doesn't mean that we have reached the place where LGBTI asylum seekers get all they need, and this could change overnight because this is basically just based on the people who are there. Change in leadership, this could all be gone. There is no guarantee in Iceland that if you are a gay man from Iran, that you will be offered asylum here. There is no guarantee if you're a lesbian from Afghanistan that you will be offered asylum here. And we have a case where someone was deported. He was lucky enough to be in love with someone here in Iceland. And that someone loved him enough back that he left the country, and it took them a long time to figure everything out, but they eventually managed to get married. And finally, he could come back after having been deported. When he tried to come back to Iceland, he was given a bill to cover the cost of the flight of his deportation, the food costs that had been spent on him during his deportation, the cost of the flights for the 5 police officers who were sent with him to deport them, and the police officers' per diems. So yeah, they might be saying more often, oh, okay, this is an LGBT issue, we should be careful, but charging somebody the cost of their deportation, including the cost of flights for the 5 police officers sent to deport a non-violent person? That shows the lived situation for LGBT asylum seekers here in Iceland. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we are, as an organization, and have been for the last years, been very clear. Legislation that protects the rights of intersex people, legislation that guarantees trans people the right to self-determination, anti-discrimination legislation, and please, please, please do something about LGBTI asylum seekers in Iceland, because their situation is quite horrific. But through personal connections, then we are getting better treatment and better responses. But as I said, that's just based on the fact that we have people who have been educated by activists, who have been poked and prodded enough that they go, okay, we must show, we can't just say that we want to do something, we have to actually enact what we say we want to do. And we need more of that from our government.
Yes, I have a question actually for Ruth regarding the process of getting the Maltese legislation through Parliament. What kinds of political responses did you get? Was there Did you see disagreement along party lines, or were there sort of ideological differences? And how did it all shake down?
Yeah. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the law that we passed was kind of happening in a context where we had just come out of a parliament that has approved marriage equality, for example. So remember divorce 2011? Then 2014, Parliament approved civil unions. They were called, and eventually it was amended to be referred as marriage. Where we've seen the opposition, who are the Christian Democrats, abstaining from those votes, right, or not voting. When it came to the gender identity law, which also protected sex characteristics aspects, we got mixed feelings at first, so mixed reactions. But the concern was mostly around gender identity and the simplification of the procedure to change one's birth certificate and the gender markers on the documents. So the main concern was around, all of a sudden we're going to have a lot of Maltese changing their documents to evade taxes or criminal offenses, so we got the usual, and we see this happening also in other countries, it's the same arguments used. When it came to intersex, it was very different, because the church, now this is my very humble opinion here, because the church did not object to the aspects of intersex children and the surgeries and to stopping the surgeries, then I think some parliamentarians felt more comfortable in saying, we agree with this. We agree with postponing or deferring or stopping the treatment, which meant that we worked mostly around the gender identity and expression aspect. When it came then to, it went through the whole process, the parliament process of enacting a law, and with its own amendments and everything. When it came to the final vote, something happened that never happened before. It was a unanimous vote. So both opposition and government voted in favor of this law, which was mind-blowing in a country like us where they never agree on anything. So, or they may agree, but not in public. But when it came to this, such an important law, such a, in my opinion, life-changing law, they agreed, and it just goes to show that when there's understanding and when we explain things and really, and that's why the human rights approach is so important, because we are really highlighting, the violations of people, the lack of respect, the lack of dignity that people are not they're not enjoying all this. So I think, that was such an important and also exciting to be witnessing this. Also, it was so powerful to have all Parliament, because it also sent out a message to the general public that, hey, we agree on this, and you might have different political views or coming from different political ideologies, or even religious beliefs, but we agree on this, and that's such a strong message to come from Parliament.
See something similar happening here. We have another question from the wider public. This is from Valerie Pierre. Which country is the most progressive for intersex issues by the standard of OII Europe, in Europe, apart from Malta, of course?
We love Malta.
Yeah.
You're very welcome to come.
I'm sure you all have some knowledge on this, so you just agree with among yourself who wants to take the question.
So that's a difficult question to answer. I would kind of say Finland, because Finland does have reference to anti-discrimination. Intersex people are covered by anti-discrimination legislation in Finland. And there we have one of the most outspoken doctors. I'd call him an activist, Mika Venhola, who refuses to perform these interventions. So this means that intersex children who are lucky enough to be born in the region where the Oulu University Hospital serves, that their parents will get told, well, you have a healthy child. Your child's biology is just a little, there's a variation here. That this isn't a medical emergency, that they should bond with their child and love their child. Of course, it's one hospital in a country that has socialized healthcare at a governmental level, so basically a parent who would sort of go, well, I've heard that these children should have surgery and sort of want that, they can just go to the next hospital. Norway is another good example because they do have anti-discrimination legislation and they're actually funding intersex work. Brava Norway. Denmark, when it comes to the health system there, I was on a panel with their board, the director of the Board of Health, and the Minister of Health was there. Both of them kept calling us disordered. It was a very tense session with a lot of intersex activists in the room, just going, why do they keep calling us disorders? But they have decided to put money towards information for parents. Now, that could be a good thing. They've pledged 600,000 Danish krona to just that part of the LGBTI action plan that they're enacting. But we'll have to see how that turns out. We'll have to see what information parents will be provided with. At OII Europe, there is sort of a toolkit for parents coming out this year called Supporting Your Intersex Child, which we will of course be sending to the Danish government. But they don't have any legislation. But at least they're putting their money where their mouth is a bit, and we'll see what route that takes. But then we have countries such as Albania and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Greece who have anti-discrimination legislation that covers intersex people. Countries that you wouldn't necessarily aren't necessarily the most likely suspects to have anti-discrimination legislation that covers intersex people. So Malta is definitely top seat. Finland, they're moving towards that direction, and we see doctors there actually taking the human rights framework into full consideration in their work. And then we have Norway, which has enacted anti-discrimination legislation and is funding intersex work, or work done by groups with people with variations of sex characteristics. Like I said before, the term intersex, it's not always the most easily translatable term just because of linguistic difference across Europe. Doesn't matter if the term, in my mind, it matters most that there is a choice of non-pathologizing language used, and that governments sort of take step towards practicing what should be in practice. So protecting from discrimination, installing multi-style legislation, and actually funding the intersex activists who are on the ground and trying to do the work.
Okay, can I comment as well? I'm sorry, I'm taking so much space. I think because it mentioned, you mentioned Bosnia and Croatia and Greece as being not the usual suspects, and I think earlier, and I think I want to comment on that because Malta is definitely not the usual suspect, right? So, and it's interesting because from Maltese perspective, everything that happens in the north is perceived as being great. And there's no problem, and there are no gaps, and everything is perfect. And Iceland is part of that. And I think we need, as advocates, as politicians, to challenge those views, because I think countries who are traditionally more advanced, progressive in their laws became complacent, and they take things for granted that anything LGBT is now sorted because we're cool and we're Nordic. Whereas we were always kind of judged and saying, oh, you conservative Catholic island in the Mediterranean, shame on you, you don't have a list of things. And that's why it's always a surprise to mention Malta, because people really never expected such a thing would come out of Malta, but expected such laws to come out of countries like this. And I think we need to challenge the discourses around how countries and governments are perceived. And we need to hold governments, even in northern European countries, accountable to these, because, again, and in so doing, we challenge the idea that everything is perfect here. And also point out that people in these countries are still suffering and are still experiencing violations and discrimination and violence. So I think it's also the role of international activists to put pressure on national governments and national, also human rights organizations, and I'm looking at Laura here, to continue putting pressure on national governments and saying, what are you doing? Things are not okay, and you need to step it up because, hey,
What you say about northern countries becoming complacent, absolutely. And that's a big part of what has happened in Iceland, for example, is that in the wake of the enactment of marriage equality in 2010, and then our first and to this point only Trans Act in 2012, as flawed as it may be, there was a sense of like, oh, we're done. Like, we did it. Yay, us. And since then, there has been no significant legislative change or advancement in this field. And what we see is that this last year, during the Pride March this summer, our organization, actually, we centered our section of the march around the rainbow map. And we lined people up in order. Each person was dressed to represent the color of a country on the map. And people were absolutely shocked to see how far back Iceland was. There was disbelief and, of course, great curiosity about how was it possible that Iceland could be, at 17th on the map and have only 47% out of this index, and what were we missing and what was wrong. And it came as a huge shock to people. And that's precisely what complacency does, is that you end up with this warped sense of reality, in the sense that we don't have anything left to do, but we do. We have a lot of work to do. And we should be passing this exam with flying colors. We shouldn't be, hoping for a minimal pass.
I mean, like, honestly, if you just look at the colors on the map, then Iceland is very, very pea yellow. Like, that's the only word I can use to describe that color, and not very healthy.
Plantgulur for the Icelandic.
We have an Icelandic term that, like, if you look at Iceland's current legal situation, like, we are closer to the Balkans than the Nordic countries, where this yellow splotch, after you see like green in the Nordics, you see green in like the Western European countries, and then a few hours flight away from our nearest neighbor, there's a big yellow splotch, which is us.
Yeah, and to challenge, as Ruth was saying, to challenge the sort of paradigm of like, oh, well, the Nordics are great, and then, you know, the Balkans are a little bit like iffy, and then why are we the same color as the Balkans? The Balkans have been moving. They've been improving things, and we've been sitting in place.
And like, when we talk about the Balkans, then we must also remember that some of the Balkans are much greener than us. We have Croatia and Slovenia, which are way ahead of us in legislation. So I don't like to pit this Nordic versus Balkan, but if Iceland is going to continue as framing itself as a place where equality has been reached, a place that doesn't really have issues in these matters, then we actually need to start working faster than the change that is happening in the Balkans right now. Like, we need to push things through and fast, because we're just going to keep falling down on this list if nothing happens. The next ILGA Europe Rainbow Map will be published in May, and I can, with confidence, state that we will do worse on this map than we did last year. Because nothing has been changed here since we did the last review. And legislative change has been taking place throughout Europe. So we're 47% now. I confidently predict that we will have less of a percentage during our next review when the map comes out, and that we will have an even lighter yellow color, possibly a lighter yellow color than we have today. We're not going to go red anytime soon, because the ILGA Europe Rainbow Map also covers countries like Russia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia. But we are each year getting closer and closer to the legal situation, closer and closer to not having the closer and closer to them in color, because no legal change is happening here. Societal change does happen here. Like, we see that every year. There's more acceptance, there's more awareness, there's more understanding. But societal change just isn't enough in a country that frames itself the way that Iceland does.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here.
Yes, thank you. My name is Sigga, and I'm actually one of the counselors at Mannréttindi Intersex. My question is about, I mean, you've been doing a great work in the Intersex, the international Intersex organizations, and you're really doing a lot of activism. And you more than one have mentioned meeting with doctors and getting all this, you know, it's hard to meet with doctors. But I'm wondering, how is it going to get the doctors on board? I mean, there must be a debate. I was very happy to hear about the doctor in Finland. But how is it going all over Europe?
There are always sort of more and more doctors who will shift a bit. So we have seen, for example, in the Nordic countries, we've seen, for example, move away from certain surgical interventions, clitoral reduction surgeries. Not that they have stopped, but that some of them are not being done any longer. Instead, they've started hyperdosing those children with steroids to shrink the size of their clitoris, with no long-term studies on the effects of hyperdosing children with steroids. So there we see sort of a shift. Cutting is bad. But they'll still take whatever means they can to normalize the appearance of that child. They've just sort of started, okay, maybe we should be doing less of the cutting. Maybe we should be looking at something else. It's a small step in shift in perception. If we keep going at this rate, we might see them move towards a place where they're actually getting what the real issues are in 40 years. because intersex activists have been poking at doctors since the early 90s. Like, intersex activists have been loud, they have been vocal, they have held protests outside of hospitals, they have held protests outside of medical conventions. So they know that we're here, and they haven't really changed practice significantly in the 25 years plus that intersex activists have been pointing this out to them, that patient support groups have been trying to work with doctors and trying to sort of convince them what you did to us was wrong. It's not just intersex activists, like we've seen patient support groups try to engage with the doctors again and again. And it's glacial. The movement is glacial. It moves possibly even slower than today's glaciers.
I'd like to add something. In my opinion, for doctors, it's something new that they should consider human rights as a very important issue as well. They're just not used to it. I'm not saying they're against it, but it's new to them. Someone else, not being professional in their field, not being a medical professional, telling them to do, or better, not to do what they used to do. That's very strange for them, and they're hardly to accept it. We've been discussing whether a ban was the best recommendation to put forward in the report or not. And to me, I was very convinced to do it, because you can also see it as a wake-up call to those doctors. Hey, what you're doing is not okay. It is a huge violation of universal human rights. So stop doing it, sit down, speak to the people who know also what they're talking about, not just from a medical point of view, but human rights point of view. And then let's see what we can agree on. And postponing certain kinds of surgery is a first step. It's definitely not the last one to be taken. But this wake-up call was very important, or is very important in my opinion.
Just to add an example of where doctors have been willing to engage. In Germany, in 2016, there were a set of clinical practice guidelines drawn up by the German Society of Urologists, Pediatric Surgeons, and Pediatric Endocrinologists, in conjunction with a number of intersex groups and patient support groups for people with variations of sex characteristics. And the guidelines, they're not binding, so they're not. It's not compulsory for surgeons, for medical professionals to follow them, but they do lay out a set of clinical practice guidelines centered around the quality of life of the individual. So this is an example of where some progress has been made.
The guidelines are actually decent. Language could be a bit better, but sort of the practice that they suggest is quite good. I'm sure that people with, because when we say intersex, we're talking about at least 30, 40 variations of sex characteristics. So I'm sure that somebody with a greater understanding of another variation of mine could poke a hole somewhere. But they are a huge step forward from anything else that is being utilized. There's only a handful of doctors in Germany who are actually actively following them. And the rest are just continuing with the same practice as before. Because there is no government telling them, oh, this is something you have to adhere to. It's being put forward as, oh, here's a good suggestion for you.
Okay. Yes?
I have a question for Laura. I was wondering how the German government has responded to the report. Because I know as a bureaucrat how valuable reports like this can have when I recommend policies to my ministry, especially if it's country specific, so I'm kind of jealous. when it comes to Denmark and Germany to have this report as a tool. So I'm wondering how the governments have followed it up.
Sure. In Germany, progress has been slowed due to the difficulties in forming a coalition government, but we do have an indication that the new coalition agreement may include a concrete commitment to look at intersex rights. It's still in draft at the moment, but we're hopeful. In Denmark, we've had a variation of responses ranging from support and willingness to go forward with our recommendations to, unfortunately, some hostility and the statements that we don't know what we're talking about. So we're continuing to engage with a number of different actors within the Danish government, including the Health Ministry, the Health Authority, the Ministry for Equalities, in order to come up with concrete ways for them to implement the recommendations that we've made.
Any other questions from the audience? Sorry? Okay. Spurning. No? Yeah? Yeah?
I was wondering if you have any thoughts on what kind of research that needs to be done on this field. Norway has just last year started the first qualitative study on living conditions of intersex people in Norway, and I think also that would be an important tool when it comes to developing policies. But if you have any thoughts on what kind of research that needs to be done to generate action.
So a first step would be research into how many interventions are taking place. Like what is actually happening within the Norwegian healthcare system. I remember attending a symposium in Norway where from the presentation that the Norwegian doctors were giving, it was quite clear that these practices are taking place there. And yeah. So getting any information on the frequency would be a good first step, because then you start to get some idea of what the problem is. The study that was performed in Germany by Ulrike Kloppel found that in sort of a 10-year period, 17,000 children had been subjected to genital surgery. It's believed that this doesn't even encompass all of them. So 17,000 children who, with variations in sex characteristics, no longer were the doctors in Germany using diagnostic terms that haven't been recognized as falling under what they call the DSD umbrella. We talk about intersex people or people with variations of sex characteristics. Instead, even though these were the same procedures that were just continuing in practice, they were now being framed as procedures or surgical interventions to fix genital malformations. So not being framed as what medical practitioners often frame as disorders of sex development, but malformations. Because there is already interest from the German government and ministries about what is going on. So we see sort of a shift in the terminology used that sort of coincides with the German government and German intersex activists sort of raising these issues in Germany. It gives us as activists this sort of feeling that practice won't change, only how it's framed.
Anyone? Okay, I think we just close the session now. I want to thank all of you for very interesting, enlightening talks. I think it is very important not only that our government and authorities get better informed here in Iceland about this topic, about this issue, but also the wider public. As I mentioned here in the opening speech, that I think this has been way too long hidden. It's a topic that many people have absolutely no idea about. They have no idea that this is happening in our hospital here across the street, and that this is affecting the lives of the children and then adults here in Iceland. And of course, we hope to see changes in legislations all around the world about this, about the rights of intersex people. This is only the beginning of the cooperation of Amnesty in Iceland and Intersex Ísland and Samtökin 78. We are just beginning our path together to campaign and call for changes. And I hope to see the Icelandic population, the population who lives here in Iceland, to really stand up with us and join forces with us so we can make sure that this will happen sooner than later. All our guests, I want to thank you again sincerely for joining us here today. And yes, I am fairly optimistic about the future. Thank you so much.
Through the entire session with us. I know that it was kind of hard to get the cars out of the parking spots this morning, so we really appreciate your being here.